Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Terry O'Dwyer. I'm the CEO and founder of LSX and the Healthspan Show. I'm really pleased to be able to moderate today's session. Today we're going to be talking about mental health. My name is Terry O'Dwyer. Hold on a sec. CEO and founder of LSX. So we're going to be talking about the responsibility that employers have for well-being of their employees and some practical ideas that we can all look at. I'm joining us today to discuss this. We have three eminent professionals in this space. Firstly, we have Karl Siemens, OBE, who is the former head of health and safety at Thames Water. We have James Brown, who is the head of health and well-being at Siemens. And we also have the global head of diversity and inclusion from Deloitte, Emma Codd. Emma is also one of the people spearheading the global business collaboration for better workplace mental health. And we'll learn a little bit more about that later on. So we've got an awful lot to be covering today. I think it might make sense if we talk about what's staring us all in the face at the moment, which is the pandemic. And I think it's safe to say that clearly the pandemic has not had a positive impact on people's mental health. But I think it would be interesting to hear from our panel, what data that they have seen about this and whether or not they have learned any kind of lessons from this. So I'm going to turn first of all to James here. I understand James has done an employee survey looking at the impact of the pandemic. So James, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your role, so in your own words, and then share a little bit of your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely, Terry. So yeah, I'm, as I said, head of health and wellbeing at Siemens Energy in the UK. So we look at energy transmission, energy generation and the use of energy in industrial settings. And we have about 3,500 employees in the UK. And actually the COVID pandemic for us is a bit complicated because we carved out from our former parent company, Siemens AG, at exactly about the time the pandemic kicked off. So it was a particularly busy and stressful time for the business without COVID as well. So it's been an interesting 12 months. But we did do an employee survey across our UK population in the late summer of last year, just looking at how COVID had affected wellbeing. And I think it's fair to say that obviously it's had a lot of negative impacts, and particularly anecdotally, I think the impact on those with caring responsibilities, whether it was parents or those with older parents that were maybe vulnerable and needed additional support. But from what the survey said, it was actually quite striking that there was a very mixed view of how COVID had affected wellbeing. So while broadly people were still sort of thought the company was doing okay to support good to support well-being, and broadly people's well-being was good, although kind of very much on a spectrum. There'd been a big divergence in people who had found the first few lockdowns very negative on their well-being versus some probably almost an equal proportion who'd actually found it had improved their well-being, which I thought was very interesting. Then if you looked at, we asked a question on how do you feel about returning to work, obviously for those who were maybe office based, because our manufacturing staff have had to sort of be in right through the pandemic. But again, there was a very mixed bag there, with a lot of people sort of looking forward to returning to work due to isolation or other issues, but just as many who were really dreading returning to work. And I think part of that was maybe the concern around the health risks and that sort of thing, but equally those who'd seen sort of a striking improvement in their work-life balance with reduced commuting and stuff. So it was a very mixed bag, and I think that's one of the sort of, obviously that data is a bit out of date now, so it'd be interesting to see what people feel like now that the sort of COVID situation is slightly different. But an assumption that people either feel positive or negative about it, I think it could be a bit dangerous.
Okay, thanks for that, James. So it sounds like quite a mixed bag, as you say. So before I turn to Emma, because I know you've done an extensive survey on this, particularly with millennials. Karl, did you want to feed into this from your experience at Thames Water? You're on mute, Karl.
I should just stay off mute. Yeah, thanks, Terry. Yeah. And it's interesting listening to James, because it was similar within Thames when we did the early surveys, and latterly last year, if I recall, 54% wanted to continue with the flexible arrangements, 45% wanted to continue working from home, 54% were more motivated working from home. So you've got, again, half the population actually wanting and enjoying the new flexible arrangements that have been put in place. And that's okay. Yeah. I mean, if I think personally, I've suddenly had a huge amount of time given back because I was off the road for an extra couple of hours a day, and that's without traffic. When that kicked in, it was even worse. So suddenly commuting has let up for so many people, which freed up so much time during the day. But it did come with challenges. We found, the ability for people to be well set up at home in the early days was a real challenge. So issuing out thousands of laptop risers and desks and chairs and getting people set up correctly was really important. But once people were set up, we found that they enjoyed the flexibility. And so what you then had was we saw absence rates decrease substantially across the organization. And as a result of people having more flexibility, so what we generally find within companies is that the 1 to 2 days, sickness and diarrhea really translates a lot of the time to I need flexibility to be able to deal with childcare and domestic arrangements that needed to be in place. And so a lot of companies that I've spoke to saw that same decrease in general sickness absence for their employees for short-term absence, which was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Again, it sounds like a mixed bag. It does seem like there has been a sort of disproportionate impact, right? So it's not affected all people equally, the pandemic. And I think I wonder if you've seen that in your organization, Karl, where certain populations have done very well or seem to be coping very well with the new normal, and others have not.
Yeah, well, half the business across Thames Water in the utility sector are field force anyway, so very little change for them. The only change there was the anxiety in the early days when we knew a lot less about the virus that was spreading. But for those who were pushed to work from home, adapting and thriving at work in the home and in the workplace was a combination of not just legal compliance for organizations to be able to get their people set up and working correctly, but then moral and ethical obligations around how do we support our employees now to allow them to get the best out of work. And that then, you're falling back into culture around leadership, around employee, around line manager led team culture. Because when my children were at home and suddenly the Wi-Fi was struggling and the pets were barking and all these things, you know what? As a manager, I was saying to my team, "That's all right. Hey, we're adapting. It's okay." And people were getting very nervous about that, and also culture around having your screen switched on. People worried about the background, and I spoke to some of my colleagues who were worried about, or they didn't have books in the background, so they were worried about not looking really intelligent. And I said, well, it doesn't matter what your background's like. These are real conversations that went on, Terry. You'd be amazed. And it was all about, people's worry about, this is my home. And, you, as a society, I think if I look back, what coronavirus has done for me is make, and not just me, but many has made working from home socially acceptable, right? Because when we used to work from home, there was definitely a stigma attached to working from home. And a lot of it was built around, I'm not being seen in the office, I'm not attending the meeting, therefore my peers or my manager might think that I'm not doing any work. And if anything, my productivity's gone up personally from working at home because I get more time to do a lot more. And lots of people have experienced that. So that's been really exciting, I think, in that I think the future will be people pulled in to offices for workshops and you know, a lot more flexibility given to the workers, but they'll go in as a part of a need basis to do face-to-face, because there is a part for that, right? Sensitive conversations, workshops, and you know, productivity discussions. There is a need for it, but doing it in the right way is really important. As a manager, I'm saying to my team, right, if you don't need to come in, don't come in. I'll tell you if there's something I really need you to come in for. And you know, then that makes people feel, oh right, okay, it's good to be working at home if I need to.
Yeah, all of that is super interesting, and we're going to get on to a discussion around some of these topics that you raised, in particular kind of culture and leadership, and also I'm keen to get the other panelists' views on what the future does look like in their organizations. I might turn to Emma now. Maybe Emma, if you could comment on, you know, how has the pandemic affected your organization and Deloitte, and what's been the experience that you've had and seen as an impact from this?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so just to sort of contextualize it, we as an organization, we have 330,000 people globally across 150 countries. And so the experience has been just very varied depending on where our people are. I mean, we have a very large part of our workforce is in India, and obviously given what's going on there at the moment, you know, it's catastrophic. And so it's sort of been in waves, I think, and depending on where you are. And my own team, my personal team, is located, you know, pretty much everywhere around the world. And so it's been very interesting depending on where we are in terms of, I think, the impact it's having on us as individuals. I'd also say that we have noticed it does. I do think there's something around what is at home. So I think being at home can work really, really well unless you have, and I think this is to Karl's point, unless you have the children in the background. You know, homeschooling I found really difficult. I'm a working parent. I have pets that always bark at the wrong time. You know, it's all of that stuff, the Wi-Fi, and it's those stresses that I just didn't have when I was going into the office. And so you're sort of trading one level of stresses for another level of stresses. So we pulsed our people all the way through this. I think always on is a real issue, the always on culture. I think for many of our people, we don't live in homes where we have offices or studies that we can go into, and therefore it is very difficult. And I myself fell foul of that. And my role is global. I end up sometimes inadvertently working UK hours and US hours. And it's that whole thing of I'm just walking past the table, oh, my laptop, let me just check. That's massively stressful. And so I myself had to learn how to deal with that. We issued very regular podcasts to our people globally, giving them hints and tips on how to deal with isolation, how to deal with grief, all of the things that they were going through. So that was from a Deloitte perspective, and it's a massive priority for us. And obviously we're a founding partner of the Global Business Collaboration on Better Workplace Mental Health, known as the GBC, which is a lot easier to say. And, you know, working with organizations that, you know, like HSBC, Unilever, BHP, and Salesforce and others, and all of us with an aim of, you know, we can talk about this in a bit more detail later, but, you know, best practice and bringing our experiences out there and sharing them. Just from some data points, which I thought might be really helpful. So we every year run our millennial survey, and if those of you that haven't seen it, it is well worth looking at. It's on Deloitte.com. Our latest one is about to be published, I think, in about a month's time. And last year, for the first time ever, we included in-depth data gathering on mental health. And actually we included it before the pandemic because it's a priority for us as an organization, and we wanted to benchmark ourselves against, you know, what the outside world was doing. Now that data that we got back from them, we did the first bit of the survey pre-first lockdown in most countries. So we went back and we pulsed around about July, August, I think. So just again to try and get an idea of, was it worse or better? And actually, I think, you know, similar to, I think it was James was talking about the difference. So in the first bit, the main bulk, we found really concerning data. And this was before the pandemic. that millennials and Generation Z, around half of them feel stressed or anxious all or most of the time. Now, that figure fell slightly for some during the pandemic, but for women and working parents, it went up. And so it was very interesting. We started to see a difference there. I don't know what we'll see in this time around. It's going to be very, very interesting. And then just a couple of other factors. So millennials and Generation Z, many of them rank mental health their first or second priority in life, which I think we're all aware of. But in terms of the stressors, the things that basically give them this concern and stress and anxiety, there are a whole range of them, things like climate, their family, financial stability, all of the things that we all probably worry about. But there are two that are within the gift of the workforce or the workplace. First one was work-life balance. The second one was the ability to be their true, authentic self at work. Now, given all the talk for many years about work-life balance and all the talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion for many years, that's quite depressing to see that so many people feel they still cannot be who they are within their workplace. And I think there's something that comes down to leadership, which I know we're going to talk about later. Only other point I wanted to make, and again, this comes back to the point Karl was making. So whilst a large number of the people we spoke to said they believed that taking time off due to stress, anxiety, or mental ill health is legitimate and they can do it, only a third of those that had taken time off for that reason actually gave the real reason to their employer. And so, this comes back to stigma, it comes back to culture. Stigma is alive and well. It comes back to organizations not actually understanding the cost to their business, not being able to signpost to support and all of those things. So, so my key messages are mental health in the workplace has been a big issue pre-pandemic. I think it's got onto the agendas of many leaders, which is a good thing during the pandemic, but I really don't want leaders to think that it is only an issue that applies during the pandemic, because it isn't. If this is something that's been with us for a long time, it's just that it's been brought to the fore due to the situation we've all found ourselves in.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points, and there's a lot we can unpack in that. I wonder if we stick first with this kind of question of the change that the pandemic is bringing about. As you say, it has kind of brought the issue to the fore. Clearly, the issue was there beforehand. It's now in the spotlight. And I'm curious as to what are employers actually doing or changing in terms of their thought processes, in terms of their policies and approaches to well-being and mental health now? Do you see direct interventions, or do you see new directions being taken? I know obviously the GBC is a good example of this, right? It's an initiative that has been born of this, but I wonder, I don't know, James, in Siemens, if you've seen a fundamental shift in direction as a result of some of the trends we've seen in the pandemic, or what's your kind of sense of this?
Yeah, I think, to be fair, in Siemens, and we're maybe because of our carve out, we're in a slightly unusual position that it hasn't been as high on the agenda as it would otherwise have been because of all the work in the carve out. But I would say personally, our fundamental approach to wellbeing hasn't been changed by the pandemic, because, as Emma sort of mentioned, like, mental health has been a real serious concern for workplaces for a number of years, and the pandemic may have exacerbated that. But fundamentally, I don't think it requires a sort of redress of how we approach it. It's just greater emphasis. I think the two areas I would take away from the pandemic is one that it across a number of organizations, wellbeing has jumped higher up the priority list. So even the organizations where it maybe hasn't been a priority, there's going to become quite a competitiveness when you look at work-life balance. The organizations that have been outspoken that everyone's returning to work on X day versus those who are saying we're not going to have offices anymore. That's going to be, obviously people feel differently about that, but that's going to be quite a big selector of who employees are going to be prepared to work for going forward. So it is definitely going to be that sort of employment pressure on all organizations to consider it from that perspective. And I've lost my train of thought on the second point, so maybe come back to me on that.
No, sure. I mean, I think that certainly resonates and echoes what Emma was saying. Maybe we turn to this question of culture. It's come up a few times already in the discussion, and we talk about a culture of well-being in the organizations that you lead. So, what does that actually mean to have a culture embedded in an organization like that? How does one organize your structure at your company to have this culture, and what do we think needs to happen here across the board to have that? Maybe Karl, I mean, Thames Water has often been mentioned to me as a huge success story in achieving this. So maybe you can tell us what your thoughts are on culture and leadership here.
So I've said for many years, the first point is it's not the physical or psychological issue that somebody has that prevents them thriving at work. It's the environment in which they are placed. And that to me is how you start the conversation with, regardless of what position people are in within the company. Whether you're in a people leadership position or you're in a team and you have peers, the reality is, the ability to get people to thrive whilst they're in the workplace is all about what we create. Historically, that was a physical manifestation about the working environment. Do we have the right equipment? Do we have the right tools? Do we have the right protective gear? And latterly now, we've really started to think about, over recent years, the psychological effects and benefits of being able to get people to thrive at work. Because if people don't have a working environment that feels safe and secure and allows them to be themselves, then you're really creating a false environment and therefore a false culture, and people will naturally leave the employer.
Can I just stop you there a little bit, Karl? Maybe you can talk a little bit about some practical tips here. What are some of the things that you did to do that? In terms of practical steps here.
Yeah, I think if you look at it, I remember the early days when I started in Thames years ago, and back in 2013, talking to the executive team about how do we start to upskill competence around psychological health within the business. So, introducing mental health programs that provide an awareness level, and that was to tackle things manifesting. One of the reasons injuries exist within companies is because we're humans. We rely on human beings. We don't always have automated systems. Therefore, humans have slips and lapses in concentration. They make errors in judgment. They're built to fail, unfortunately. We have flaws. So understanding that, to be able to tackle that, you can't separate physical and psychological health management and its impact on illness and injuries. So putting in place good competency upskilling, and then how you engage across the organization. So what are the media and tools that you use? So social media within many organizations, within Thames, for example, we used Yammer, and people used it as a tool to be able to connect and communicate. The great thing about social media in business is 100% positive, right? Because there's a natural corporate efficacy that you don't get in the likes of external, because people don't know who you are. Yeah, and anybody could say anything. In the workplace, Yammer was always positive. And what I liked about it was people used it as a self-esteem. So everyone likes, yeah? And, the more likes people get, the more they feel good, right? And that's just human nature. So it was nice seeing people share that and be connected in teams. So that from a engagement perspective, comms wise, we drip fed naturally so many good messages around mental health. Because remember, mental health, by the reason the stigma exists, is historical in terms of you have mental health issues. My mental health right now is really good. I feel positive, and my mental fitness is good. So the reality is you're always on a spectrum as to the ups and downs of modern and day pressures in life. And we got people to understand that through the competence, but also sharing illustrative stories of individuals that had suffered hardship and individuals talking about positive mental health as well. You have to balance it. There's a few examples of many.
This is some really excellent examples. Just to say to the audience, we have some questions coming in from you guys, and I will get to them eventually. We still have a good amount of time, about 15 minutes. So keep the questions coming, and I'll save 10 minutes at the end to go through them. So maybe just sticking on this topic of practical tools or tips or ideas really to move the needle here, given that is one of the key central points of this panel. Emma, you mentioned obviously on the engagement side of things with the comms front, you did an awful lot to educate your employees about some of these issues. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on what worked or what didn't work in terms of engagement, in terms of upskilling competence on these issues. Could you give us your thoughts there?
Yeah, I just want to say to start with, I 100% agree with what Karl's just said. I'll be sitting nodding. I think success in this area is really a big part about your everyday culture. And and I often find the minute you mention culture, everyone says, "Oh, it's this culture, it's this huge thing." And to me, it's very simple. It's how you feel. So when you're physically going into a building or you're virtually at work, do you feel included or excluded, respected or disrespected? And that word respect is a big thing. Now, from a practical perspective, I can talk a bit about what we did and what I did in the UK. So prior to my global role, for 6 years, I was managing partner for talent for Deloitte UK, working very closely with our CEO. I was on our firm's executive team, so one of the people that ran the organization. And that's the first point, is I sat on that leadership team. I sat alongside our CEO, and it was a leadership priority. And it was talked about by our CEO constantly. We identified that we needed to work on our culture. When we were speaking to our people told us that sometimes the behaviors that they experienced, from whether it was down to an ability to talk about or be their true selves, that they thought that we could get better on that. And so what we did was we approached the entire thing from a culture change perspective, and we started talking about a respectful and inclusive culture where everyone can really thrive. And then we focused on particular interventions, so across a range, so all aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and from a mental health and well-being perspective. And some of the things that that work, I think, honestly, are really, you look at, I think people often think, oh, it's Deloitte, they must have a huge amount of money that they spend on this. And the reality is, the things that we did really didn't cost a lot. They were things that, it doesn't cost anything for your CEO to talk about the importance of mental health, for your leaders to talk about their own experiences. We have the amazing John Binns, who is still an advisor to Deloitte, was a partner, and John spent so much time going around talking about his own experience, how he dealt with mental ill health, how he is thriving. And then we had other partners and leaders that did the same, whether it was at round tables. We made This Is Me. We did the This Is Me campaign, which I love. And it was a real chance for people to tell their stories. And then I'd say the final thing, so we did index, so the Mind Index we found very helpful. And one of the things that we did there was part the way through, when we were really pushing on mental health, and even just getting people to use those words, frankly. So making sure that they are saying mental health rather than some of the other descriptions that can be used, because we needed it to be there. It's physical health and mental health. It's very important we talk about mental health. And one of the things the Mind Index showed us was that despite everything we'd done, our people still did not feel that our leaders would be able to give them, signpost them for support if they disclosed that they were suffering from mental ill health. And so the way that we went about that was we basically did mental health first aid training for 1 in 4 of our leaders. And we really pushed it. We again talked about it. We held leadership sessions. So it's all of those things. I think often organizations like to think there's a shiny new thing that they can introduce that's going to be the big solution, or they think it's a policy. Now, policies are really important. I totally agree. We need the right policies. We need leading policies. But actually, it's whether we live that. Same with work-life balance and agile working. So for us with the pandemic, when many people were first experiencing working from home, that was sort of ingrained in how we worked. We trusted people. We'd got rid of the culture of presenteeism already. And so, I do come back to it being about culture and leadership behaviors. If your leaders are not behaving in a respectful and inclusive way, then I think it's very difficult to bring about change. If you can get them all understanding and behaving in a way that is always inclusive and always respectful, I think that's a really big part of the journey already.
Yeah,
it costs nothing.
It's a really, really important point that you raise, and obviously it seems kind of obvious, doesn't it, that it comes from the very top. So anything that we can do to encourage our leaders to behave in this way is going to work. And I understand, Emma, that that is essentially what the GBC is about, right? Like it's the central message or point of the GBC is to get the C-suite of major companies to be vocal and support these issues and demonstrate these kind of ideas. Do I have that right?
You do, and that's the whole ethos behind it. So the organisations that have come together to do this, and please sign the pledge, go on to the GBC's website and look at it, and encourage your leaders sign it. The whole ethos, the thing we all have in common is we all believe it has to be led from the top. It has to have CEO responsibility and accountability. My own CEO, Puneet Ranjan, our global CEO, was a proud signatory of that pledge, has been massively supportive because he believes this is part of our DNA. This is what we have to be doing. And the pledge actually focuses on the issues that we've all been talking about. So, it's about, yes, get an action plan together, but focus on culture. Take active steps to eliminate stigma, empowering your people to manage and prioritize their mental health, signposting to support, and then really important, measure progress. So it's not convoluted. The pledge is it's out there, it's very sensible, and most importantly, it applies globally. I think the global south that has, it's sort of patchy in terms of what needs to be done from, it's quite a long way to go in some parts of the world, and we needed something that would apply to a large business, a tiny business. But yeah, it's all about CEO leadership and really committing, not just signing this, but then actually committing to take action.
That's great, and we'll link to the pledge in the chat so people can take a deeper look at that. I do want to turn to some of the questions which are actually relevant to this point. I mean, we've talked a lot about culture and leadership already. And obviously, that comes from the behaviors of the leaders of the organizations and everything that you described, question. But there is this question of the corporate wellness providers in this space, right? And there's a question from the audience here, which is, is it in the corporate interest to invest in corporate wellness providers to help implement some of these culture shifting programs for employees? And I guess that speaks more widely to the question of, what is the ROI of some of these corporate wellness programs and so forth. Maybe, I don't know if we turn to James, if you want to comment on that, and I'll bring in Karl's perspective too.
Yeah, I'll just really quickly jump back to Emma's point there on culture, and don't want to sort of bang on about it, but I completely agree with everything there. And I think the most powerful thing we did with mental health within Siemens was our CEO about 5 years ago getting up in front of our leadership conference and talking about his own experience with burnout earlier in his career, and following that, a lot of our employees being brave enough to share their own stories on I think it was Time to Talk Day a few years ago. And I think more than any of the other initiatives we have done, that has been the most powerful thing in sort of destigmatizing mental health. I think I'm someone that very much has a bias towards sort of processes and systems and data and shiny new wellbeing things. But actually, sort of, I think in the last 5 years, I've sort of definitely appreciated more and more the sort of fundamental value of culture change as sort of the preeminent thing we need to look at. But yeah, sorry, going on to your question on external wellbeing providers and ROI. I personally don't like talking about ROI because I like to drive wellbeing from a it's not something I ignore, but I like to drive it from a cultural and values perspective, that this is something that all responsible employees should prioritize. So as soon as someone starts talking to me about that, I sort of switch off, to be honest, partly because obviously there's a lot of metrics you can track on wellbeing performance. You're looking at your sickness absence data, your turnover data, your engagement data, but actually looking at underlying change in health and then associating it with your wellbeing program is quite a tricky exercise because of the huge amount of factors there, the time it takes to measurable change on a population level. So absolutely, with providers that can have got detailed data on implementing solutions that provide measurable impacts, that's really important. But for me, it's more what level of participation does the initiative drive in the company? What level of engagement do employees value it? Do employees get start using that on a day-to-day basis to sort of drive health improvements, rather than sort of getting hung up on what the data is telling us on the outcomes? But colleagues might want to step in and disagree there.
Yeah, Karl, I mean, how do you agree with James and how he's approached this in his organization, or how do you do things at Thames?
Yeah, partly. I think look, there's corporate wellness programs, whether it be physical or psychological, will always exist because a company can't do everything themselves. So I'll give you a great idea of that. So within Thames, I run the clinical team, which had a doctor and 6 occupational health professionals. Yet one of the early conversations I had with the executive team was, we all have our Bupa annual medicals. Is that because we are more important than the receptionist downstairs or the plant fitter out on the site? And the reality is, well, of course we're not. So we offered everybody across the company access to an annual personal confidential medical assessment face-to-face with a medical professional. We couldn't run that internally because you've got thousands and thousands of people. But the way I put it to them also was, when you're looking at ROI, so at the minute we pay £50 to MOT each of our vehicles every year to make sure it's safe and suitable for our people. Yet we say our people are our most valuable asset. So why wouldn't we pay £50 to give our people an MOT? You know, so you can turn the language into very carefully what the reality is. Everybody at Thames is offered an annual personal confidential medical assessment. And when you're looking at ROI, you can't confuse either costs with value. So I know right now that in the last 5 years, you know, I've had 188 people down tools and go straight to A&E, where blood pressure, stress levels causing blood pressure, and cholesterol levels off the scale, you know, and walk-in cardiac cases, really. You know, I've had 98 people that have been diagnosed with, I've had excessive levels of a cancer testing that we did for prostate and we did for bowel cancer, all, you know, abnormal levels. 13 people have phoned me up. It's confidential, but 13 people phoned me up and said, thanks very much, you've identified that I've got cancer. But they were phoning up to thank us because it was so early. You know, so when you start to, and they get radiotherapy as opposed to chemo and hormone treatment, it's so different, the value you can bring from having the right programs in place. And when you think then about the psychological impact of, you know, people actually getting, their employer is actually benefiting them, you know, because my belief is, you come to work a certain condition, you should leave them in a better condition when you finish your employment. You know, you should be kept safe and well. And well means physical and psychological. You should thrive and enjoy being in the workplace. So there is a view that, in my view, that I have used corporate providers in a way when I need to. But I go back to what Emma says. Yeah, you don't need to spend lots of money to have a good, sensible strategy around physical and psychological health within your company. It is all about how you engage in, primarily from a leadership, line management, and employee, to be able to create a culture of care to enable you people to thrive.
Very well said, Karl. Emma, if you wanted to respond to those points, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, I've got a few questions from the audience I can lob at you guys.
The only thing I want to say, and I was just looking at the questions, which I rarely do, because I'm not very good at concentrating on more than one thing. But I was looking at, and there's the question here, I think, around to implement culture shifting programs, and it's that word. There's the words culture shifting. And look, all I can say is, from my perspective, there were loads of providers out there who, of course, will do an amazing job. We actually designed our own. We did our own approach. We sat down, we looked at our data. I'm also a bit like James, I am a bit of a data nerd as well. I like to get my data, but I also like to listen to my people, as no doubt my colleagues do as well. And we put both of those together to identify the issues. And then we sat there and thought, with our knowledge about, I'm actually, I am a partner in the business. I was a client serving partner before I was put into the talent role. And I just sat there and thought, look, knowing the business as I do, I've come up in this business. I know all my colleagues. How do I get this mind shift? With not all of them, with some of them. How do I explain about our words and actions and the impact they can have on others? How do I explain there is no grey, it is black and white? And so it was those things. And so we designed our own. It didn't cost us anything. And that was how we did it. So now I recognize that, again, this whole thing about large company, lots of people, actually, I only had 2 other people working with me at that time. And we sort of did it ourselves, pretty much on the back of a fag packet to start with, but it worked. And it was then, alongside getting the CEO, really getting him to talk about what he believed in so much and just be open. So I think for culture change, I would just say, your business. Now, there are lots of people that will have solutions. And you've seen this when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, with lots of pushing on unconscious bias training. And there's quite a lot of comment now about, is that the right thing? Does it work? Again, we didn't do that. We again focused on everyday culture through people talking together. I think, to Karl's point, just having open conversations about this. So that's the only thing I'd say is, I think, never underestimate that your business, your challenges, and then you may have to bring some expertise in, of course, to do some of it, but know that your business.
Yeah. Just to add to my earlier point, I think what I would say is, with the culture changing thing, our personal experience within Siemens Energy has been doing that internally without professionals. I'm sure there's lots of professional organizations out there who do a great job, but the area we obviously would use external suppliers for their professional expertise is in the competency training around mental health. So if we're doing mental health awareness training, mental health first aid training, stress and resilience training, you absolutely want sort of qualified professionals delivering that. And rather than, again, there might be perfectly acceptable ways of doing it with the train approach, but yeah, that's where we've sort of tended to go outsource to get technical experts.
Yeah, thank you. That's all very helpful. I think it does also answer one of the earlier questions that was put to the panel, which is, for a smaller business with less resources or finances, what is the one thing you could suggest that they could do to have a significant impact on the wellness there? I think you've talked about leadership, but
Terry, can I just butt in with one thing for the smaller businesses as well? Is don't forget about the Thriving at Work website, the Gateway. There's a huge amount of information, and I should know the proper name for this website because I'm part of the Leadership Council, the Thriving at Work Leadership Council. But it's an amazing amount of resource that's out there and I don't know, Terry, whether you can get the link around or
this is. I think you're talking about the mind-led initiative. It's Thrive at Work.
Thrive at Work. Yes, and there's the website, which is amazing. And it has loads and loads of information and really helpful. I remember looking at it thinking, if I was a small business, which I used to many years ago, I had my own business, and I know how tough it is to find spare money to do anything. And so look on there. There is a mass of fantastic information and resource.
Yeah, it's the Mental Health at Work Gateway. You can get through the Mind website.
Thank you, Karl. Okay. I should know, my brain's too full of other stuff.
Okay, we've kind of reached the 12:45 mark, but we have a few minutes more to wrap up. Sorry if we didn't get to all of the questions, but I do want to give an opportunity to each of the panelists to share their views on the future, on where we're heading with this. I think some comments have already been made about, you know, the obvious sort of fundamental shift in working dynamics that have occurred now. So maybe if you could each maybe comment on, you know, where you see things heading. Take out your crystal balls if you wish, and tell us what you see lies ahead for well-being at work in the next 5 years. Maybe if I start with you, James.
I was worried you'd say that. It's going to copy off the others, but I think for me, just thinking about this, I think wellbeing is still, as an industry, quite in its infancy, and especially in the last few years, we've seen a huge sort of number of sort of startups coming out in huge variety of fields because there's such a breadth to wellbeing interventions, whether you're looking at support around parental leave and either side of that, whether you're looking at sleep, nutrition, the scope is sort of endless. So I sort of see as the industry matures that there'll be sort of an aggregation. So you see more suppliers who offer a more sort of joined up, all-encompassing sort of wellbeing solutions for companies. I'm not sure if increasing regulation is necessarily the route it'll go down, but increased structure in terms of maturity around accreditations that companies can sign up to and join to sort of demonstrate they're responsible employers, and just an increasing demand from customers that the solutions that are being sold to them are evidence-based and there's good sort of data to back that up. So I think that's just, yeah, going down the route of being a more mature industry.
Okay. Karl, what about you?
Well, I think the coronavirus pandemic has only served to speed up the thinking around psychological and physical health management by organizations. And thus, I think, as companies get much better in the future as a result of the rise and escalation in visibility and popularity of terms like mental health management and what it means, as that increases, I think industry will increase for the better for it. And as we know, government legislation follows industry. So I think more organizations that aren't listening and aren't doing things will actually be pushed and prompted by government and legislation to be able to actually have to do those things. That's going to follow naturally because that's the general cycle of how legislation works in this country. And I'm a big fan of that. And I think I'm in talks right now with the government about, you know, what does post-COVID, you know, the pandemic look like in terms of the advice and guidance that should be given out, and what are we doing about it? So, you know, there's a lot, I think, that can be learned from organizations that are doing it well. And that's the great thing about how the civil service works in terms of listening and bringing in specialists and leaders within organizations, harvesting the work that they're doing, and then turning that into guidance for society across the board. So I think the future, in my view, will be very good, and it looks very positive in terms of us learning from what has been a really horrific last year and a half.
It's good to sense the optimism there, Karl. What about you, Emma? Are you equally optimistic?
I am, I think. Look, I think we've just gone through something that none of us ever imagined we would go through. And I think, you know, a week doesn't go by where you don't hear the words future of work or hybrid working, or you know, and I think that's a good thing as long as we really do rebuild better. What worries me about hybrid working is that we'll end up building another layer of exclusion if we don't get it right. So I think we're at this point now where we can choose. We can look at, from a mental health perspective, let's look at the things we know are stressors. Let's look at the way we work. You know, people are telling us it's work-life balance, it's the way we work, it's inability to be true, authentic self, all of those things. Let's look at them. And when we rebuild, let's rebuild with them in mind. So I think there's a real opportunity here. CEOs are massively engaged in this at the moment. But let's see that engagement continue, because there's a chance it could drop away. So I think we're at this tipping point, and it's either going to go one way where we do rebuild better, or I worry that it could go the other way, where actually we don't learn from what we've been through, and we don't seize the opportunity to rebuild in a way that works for everybody.
If I just say, Terry, Emma's spot on there in terms of listening to the workforce. Yeah. And one of the programs that we launched within Thames last year was what the future world of work looks like, for a lot of people together and to create a document that actually helps. And we sent it out recently to the managers. And it's all about empowering the line manager to have the ability to create the right working environment for the employee they have. So this is really remarkable in terms of, we're saying, here you go, have the conversation, here's some guidelines, have the conversation, but does your employee want flexible working? Do they want to come in back into the office? But the key point is, the key message is the empowerment to that line manager to make the right decision. I think you've got to get to a point where it's a really mature organization to be able to do that. But ultimately, the net effect will be a much better productivity, because the employee gets what they want. So it's benefiting the organization in terms of return on investment from the individual. So you can do that in lots of ways. And I think that's really powerful, what's happening.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave the discussion at that. I hope everyone has taken away some very valuable messages from this discussion. There are a few links that we'll share to some of the points raised here. But just to sign off with a huge thank you to our panelists for joining us today and sharing their thoughts. So Karl, from formerly of Thames Water, Emma from Deloitte, and James from Siemens, thank you very much for your contribution and participation. I hope everyone spends the time today to join some of the other sessions at the Healthspan Show. I'm sure you'll find them equally valuable, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.